In 2025, another latest zombie thriller is coming. In a future world overrun by zombies, human civilization has been utterly destroyed, and cities are no longer habitable. A boy named Marco has been living in the forest with his father since childhood. To protect against unknown dangers, Marco's father gives him a pistol for self-defense. However, Marco is too weak to pull the bolt, and the gun falls to the ground. Marco nervously looks at his father. Though father and son rely on each other, his father is a man of few words, rarely interacting with Marco or showing concern for his growth. This leaves Marco feeling extremely lonely. However, his father is deeply afraid of the zombies outside and refuses to let Marco leave the forest until he is capable of protecting himself. Marco is curious about the outside world. Every time he goes to fetch water, he marks the trees along the way, slowly expanding his trail toward the distance. One day, Marco discovers an abandoned RV in the forest. Cautiously, he approaches and climbs in through the window, finding a toy on the shelf. Just then, a shadow appears inside the RV, startling Marco. He hides, trembling in a corner. Luckily, the figure does not seem hostile. When the figure hands him the toy, Marco realizes it's a boy about his age. Feeling the boy's kindness, Marco takes out his headphones and invites him to listen to music. Thus, the two lonely children become friends. Marco doesn't dare tell his father about the encounter. He hides the toy Miko gave him and rushes back to camp with the water jug. However, because he was gone for too long, his father becomes furious, causing Marco to drop the chestnuts he was holding. His father assumes Marco was just picking chestnuts and doesn't ask further. From then on, Marco frequently returns to the RV and learns that Miko lives with his mother. Miko's mother is different from Marco's father. She is warm and affectionate, often embracing Miko tenderly. Inspired, Marco tries to hug his father, but is pushed away. Seeing a photo of an unfamiliar woman in the room, Marco gathers the courage to ask his father about her that night. His father doesn't answer, only telling Marco to go to sleep. Once, his father gave him a fairy tale book about a fairy who left the forest for a place called Stone Valley. Marco believes that his mother must be the fairy, and if he goes to Stone Valley, he will find her. One day, while hunting in the forest as usual, Marco and his father hear gunshots in the distance. Marco quickly hides behind a large tree. He then sees Miko's mother, clutching her arm in pain, kneeling before his father. Without hesitation, his father approaches her. Terrified, Marco runs home and hides under his blanket. Shaking with fear, his father doesn't return until late at night. When he finally comes back, he is in a very unstable state, drinking heavily and muttering incoherently. His father's violent mood makes Marco even more determined to find his unknown mother. The next day, he packs his things and secretly leaves home. Marco went to the RV to find Miko, planning to take him to Stone Valley to search for his mother. But after walking a short distance, Miko suddenly stopped. Marco had no choice but to tell the truth. Soon, they reached the edge of the forest. Just then, a strange figure appeared in front of them, and they quickly crouched down to avoid being seen. The two of them quickly ducked into a car along a small path. As the sound of footsteps grew louder around them, they nervously glanced out the window. Suddenly, the sound of zombies banging on the window terrified Miko. Marco could only cover Miko's ears with his hands. Just when he didn't know what to do, all the zombies outside suddenly collapsed. As the car door opened, a shake in Marco realized it was his father who had arrived. After checking that Marco wasn't bitten, his father finally relaxed. He ignores Miko in the car and forcefully pulls Marco. Intending to return to the camp, Marco resisted strongly, shaking off his father's grip, accusing him of being a bad man, of killing Miko's mother, and even suspecting that his own mother had died at his father's hands. His father didn't have time to explain. He knew that the noise would soon attract more zombies, but Marco refused to leave. So his father, with no choice, hid him in a safe spot and returned to rescue Miko. His father's aim was precise, taking out the remaining zombies with a single shot each. Then, he pulled Miko out of the car, but at that moment, Marco turned around and suddenly noticed a zombie behind him. He quickly grabbed his father's handgun, trembling as he raised it. The sudden gunshots startled his father, who rushed toward Marco's direction, only to be knocked down by a zombie. Thankfully, his father manages to kill the zombie and quickly returns to Marco's side. Seeing that the danger has passed, he signals that Miko is safe and urges Marco to return to the camp with him. But just as his father rolled up his sleeve, he noticed a wound on his arm, and despair quickly set in. He hurriedly moved away from Marco and chained himself to a tree. Marco seemed to realize something. He approached his father, and only then did his father finally speak the truth. He hadn't killed Miko's mother, she had been bitten by a zombie, and his actions had actually saved her. Marco hugged his father tightly, and his father wanted to embrace his son too, but he knew he would soon mutate into a bloodthirsty, violent zombie, so he had no choice but to cruelly push Marco away and urge him to leave quickly. Marco had no choice but to listen. He took Miko by the hand and walked down the path. Not long after they leave, his father's eyes turn white. Then, he heard a gunshot echo through the forest. Marco paused briefly, but didn't stop walking. Without his father's protection, he had to become stronger. Night fell, and Marco and Miko hid under a large tree. Marco was filled with uncertainty about the future, but his mother's photo gave him strength. The next day, they continued their journey and eventually emerged from the forest into an open field. They followed the railroad tracks for an unknown distance. Their food was nearly gone, but luckily, they came across a man listening to a radio by the side of the road. The man looked Marco and Miko up and down. Marco gathered the courage to ask the man for food, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he asked where they were headed. After hearing their destination, he said that although he wanted to help them, he couldn't leave because he had several children at home to care for. Marco looked at the iron bars, and in the next second, it turned out the man's children had accidentally been infected and turned into zombies. Unable to bring himself to kill them, he locked them up. After eating, Marco and Miko continued on their way, playfully bickering, no longer feeling so lonely. As the day grew late, they had to find a place to spend the night. An abandoned train on the tracks seemed like a good choice. Marco approached and pried open a gap, only to find the car was filled with zombies. The two were terrified. Luckily, the zombies were trapped inside and couldn't get out. They narrowly escaped, but before they can get far, two armed men stop them and force them into a vehicle. A few hours later, they arrive at a survivor camp. The leader, John, looks at the two uninfected children with surprise and delight. It turned out that ever since the zombie outbreak years ago, all newborn babies have been infected with the virus, putting humanity on the brink of extinction. Now, seeing two healthy boys, John believed they might hold the key to curing the virus. However, compared to the simple-minded Miko, Marco seems harder to control. John orders his men to eliminate him. One of the men, unable to bring himself to harm a child, secretly lets Marco go. But Marco didn't abandon Miko. Seeing that the man refused to help, Marco quietly returned to the camp. After finding Miko, he led him to safety, evading the guards and escaping. The next day, John discovered the children were gone and immediately killed the man. Marco and Miko didn't know how far they had run. Miko kept asking for water, and Marco, feeling very annoyed, muttered that he should have just left him behind. But seeing Miko's pitiful look, Marco's heart softened, and he went to find him some water. He enters a nearby abandoned building, where he finds supplies left behind by other survivors. He took some clothes and found half a bottle of water in a box. Marco then went to the balcony, and for the first time, he saw the true face of the world. Most people have turned into monsters, and the forest was just a fairy tale world his father created to shield him from evil. Suddenly, he hears noise downstairs. It was John and his man, who had tracked them down. John pulled out a gun, ready to kill Miko. Unexpectedly, a drone appeared overhead, making John nervous. The next second, gunshots erupted, and John and several of his men were instantly killed. Marco hid in the shadows and watched quietly as two fully armed soldiers emerged. Miko saw Marco and shook his head, signaling him to leave quickly, but the noise he made drew the soldiers' attention. Miko, seeing that Marco was about to be discovered, secretly picked up a gun from the ground. The soldiers reacted too quickly, and by the time they realized what happened, they had already killed Miko. Marco was devastated. He knew Miko had died trying to protect him. After the soldiers leave, Marco pulls himself together and continues his journey alone, still determined to find his mother. But the Stone Valley was just a place his father had made up, and Marco could never actually find it. After leaving the protective, fairy tale-like forest, Marco began to realize this. In anger, he tore the fairy tale apart and screamed in frustration, but all he heard in response was the endless silence and coldness. He then climbed a mountain and looked down at the magnificent city below. With nowhere else to go, Marco curiously walked into it. This was the giant stone forest, a place he had never seen before. He realized this could be Stone Valley, but the city was still overrun with zombies. Marco carefully avoided the zombies and entered an abandoned hospital. He pushes open a hospital room door and sees a woman in white. Just like the fairy from his story, he thought it was his mother and cautiously stepped forward to hug her. The woman quickly took Marco's hand, but the next second, Marco felt a sharp pain on the back of his hand. When the woman turns around, Marco realizes she's not a fairy but a zombie. Marco quickly ran away and used an iron rod to block the door. The sound of zombies banging on the door echoed behind him, and Marco broke down in despair, crying. The relentless blows of reality were indeed too cruel for a young boy like Marco to endure. After escaping the hospital, Marco discovered a wall full of missing person posters. He added a photo of his mother to it. Then he came to an abandoned building, drawn by the sounds coming from inside. When he entered, he realized it was a holographic projection. The noise had attracted a horde of zombies, and the flimsy iron door wouldn't hold for long. Exhausted and broken, Marco gave up on running. He put on his headphones, waiting for the zombies to overrun him. Just then, bullets rained down from the sky like a storm. When Marco opened his eyes again, he finally saw the fairy he had been searching for. Her light was blinding. The female soldier removed her helmet, and upon noticing the wound on Marco's hand, she immediately drew her gun in defense. But Marco felt no fear. He quietly embraced the soldier and gently wiped away the tears on her face. At this moment, the female soldier noticed the M symbol on the boy's arm. It was the mark of post-apocalypse newborns, immune to the virus, a symbol of humanity's last hope. With that, Marco grabbed the female soldier's hand and followed her as they left together. This film wasn't filled with excessive gore or violence. It feels more like a zombie-themed art film, through the eyes of a child. It explores the end of the world, showing that they are also the hope for rebuilding human society.